I'm delighted to be talking to an audience and getting their very diverse views on something that's important not only to our community, but universally. So, because it is such a personal and deeply emotional subject, I just want to tell you a bit about where I'm coming from. As you said in your introduction, Kirandeep, I've been a migrant many times over. But I come from a refugee family, and for a long time, whenever anybody asked my mother, "Where do you come from?" even though we had been in Delhi for a long time, she would say, "We are from Rawalpindi." I've written about that in the book The Girls Ate Last, and her story and of partition and how it affected our family. And when I went to Malaysia, I became a writer rather than just a sociologist and anthropologist and a financial historian. And then when I went to Australia, I went from journalism back to study and completed my PhD and emerged as a sociologist of money. And it was really when I was doing my last book, Money, Migration, and Family. And for a long time, I had seen money as a medium of care. You know, you send money home, it's a way of showing that you care for your family. And, you know, you receive shagan, it's a way of showing that you have a relationship. But then I heard uh, Ekta's story, and she told me how her husband used to send all his earnings to his family in India, and how she and her daughter were left to do with very little, and that money and remittances became a medium of abuse. And that started me on thinking of money not just as a medium of care, but also a medium of abuse. And around the same time, the awareness of family violence was rising in the state of Victoria, where I live, by an absolutely fascinating and comprehensive report from the Royal Commission into Family Violence in 2016. So we started this project to compare across cultures, Anglo-Celtic and Indian, partly because we wanted to show that this is something that happens in all communities, but also building on the research expertise in the Anglo-Celtic community and in the Indian community. So I'm drawing on these open-ended interviews with 47 people. And as I read the Royal Commission report, they said that gambling was financial abuse, which is a very important part of family violence. And I just sort of got halted on my tracks, as it were, because my first husband was a gambler. And I had never seen it in terms of financial abuse. I had seen it in terms of financial irresponsibility. And then as I talked about it, and my sense of surprise, and as I listened to other women telling their stories, I found I was not alone. Women of my generation did not really have a language to speak about family violence. And, you know, women, Anglo-Celtic women told me that they had thought that they were paranoid, that they were going slowly mad until they maybe saw the cycle of family violence. And they say, yes, 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 this is what happened to me. And they started talking and sharing what had happened. And so one of the first things that came through in the study was that women across cultures who have experienced family violence have very similar experiences. They sometimes even use the same language. They said, you know, how they couldn't do anything right. And Anglo-Celtic women, that is women of English, Scottish, Welsh, or Irish background in Australia, they said, you know, I would walk on eggshells. And even the Indian women said, I'd walk on eggshells. It was, you know, in one case, an Anglo-Celtic woman said she had made salad and he didn't like the dressing and he threw the dish at her and cracked her skull. And Indian women would tell me how the husband would say, after the woman had come from a long shift at work, that how come the chapatis aren't ready? And there would be a big fight saying, you're no good at all. You're no good as a mother. You're no good as a wife. You're no good as a partner. What did your mother teach you? And the other thing that was a matter of deep hurt, sometimes even after 20 years of, when the family violence, when the financial abuse had stopped. An Anglo-Celtic woman said, I asked her, I said, when all this was happening, didn't you talk to your mother? And she said, yes. And my mother said, you made your bed, you lie in it. And that's when she broke down and cried during the interview. And Indian women, professional, educated, young, would say, when I asked her, didn't you share it with your mother? And she said, yes, I shared it. And the mother said, adjust, adjust. The first year is always difficult. And then I'd ask, didn't you go to the Gurdwara? Didn't you go to the church? And they said, no. Part of it is that these religious institutions are male, and they continue to see family violence as a private matter, not a social issue. When I went to a Gurdwara, the person said, oh, they come to the Gurdwara. What happens behind closed doors, we don't know. And it's the same thing with the church. And also migration plays a part. A young woman who was in public relations in India before marriage, I asked her, you go to the Gurdwara every week, didn't you tell somebody? And she said, but everybody I knew in the Gurdwara was his friend, and they wouldn't have believed me anyway. So there was a similar lack of support at times from the main cultural institutions of the community and also from their parents. And they didn't really know what it was that they were doing that was making for this abuse. So when I heard the stories and I started reading the literature, Evan Stark's view of coercive control being at the center of family violence really struck a bell, because what he says is that it works over time, attacking gender identity. It attacks and exploits and isolates the woman by saying that you're not a good woman, you're not a good mother, you're not a good partner, you're not a good homemaker. And it starts with constraining, with monitoring, with regulating commonplace activities, with setting rules that change every day that you don't know how you can put your foot right. And that leads us to the gender of money, because the gendered identity of a person does not lie just in her gendered roles. Because money is a social and cultural phenomena and a medium of relationship, it has gender. Men and women use and inherit and manage and control money in different ways across cultures. Uh, there's one universal trait, though. Women use more of their money than men on their children and household. But because I was studying Anglo-Celtic money before I started studying money, the gender of money in India, I was struck by the differences as to how money in the Anglo-Celtic world was owned by the couple, and how money in India is owned by the family. How in the Anglo-Celtic society, the middle-income Anglo-Celtic society, money was seen as private to the couple. You didn't talk money with your adult children. You saw they'd bought a new car and they thought it was all right. And often parents did not give money to adult children, and they didn't even expect their children to give them any money. So much so that when I came back after interviewing all these people, and I had my younger son with me, and I told him, I said, listen, when you grow up, remember that I'd be very happy to accept money, because I had grown up thinking that it is filial to use money as a medium of relationship. So but the gender of money is also different in cultures, but every culture has where in every culture, money has gender. So because of it, financial abuse across cultures, there are continuities. It means that the husband will deny the wife access to money, will monitor and control expenditure, and will appropriate her money and property. And this happens whether you have a joint bank account or a separate account. Both become media of coercive control. And at times, the woman has no effective bank account that she can use. And it results in the woman and children having to do without. I heard one Anglo-Celtic woman telling me that she used to take her children into town, and then she'll tell the children to go to the toilet in town. And after a little while, she said, it cut the water bill. And she'd say how she would calculate to the nth degree that, all right, she needed 5 servings of meat, and that's all she would buy. Whereas her husband was having a business, but he did not share any of his money with her. So what happens is that the joint account in the Anglo-Celtic community, that's supposed to be a symbol of togetherness in marriage, can become a medium of abuse when the joint account becomes a means whereby the husband can control the woman's money without necessarily putting any money into the joint account. And the Indian community, the husband will use the traditional male control and family ownership of money, but forgets that it goes along with the responsibility for the welfare of his wife and children. So it is as if the same medium that's supposed to communicate care becomes a medium of communicating abuse. But because the gender of money differs across culture, financial abuse also can differ across culture. In India, for instance, the patrilineal joint family, that is a family of parents, married sons, and their children, uh, that is the norm, though there is a great diversity, but in popular imagination, that is the Indian family. And our study has shown that men across generations, whether it is the father or the son, they often control money. But at the same time, it is as if they have the full responsibility of the welfare of every member in the family. And unlike money in the Anglo-Celtic world, money is owned by the family, not the couple. And there is a give and take of money across generations instead of money being private to the couple. Parents often, when I was interviewing for the migration book, parents would often say how they had to, dip into their retirement funds, sell assets to send their children, most often sons, to Australia to study. And I'd ask, aren't you worried that you won't have enough for your retirement? And they said, what's the point of giving if you don't give in a timely fashion? And the expectation was that the children, and usually sons, will fulfill their filial duty. And most often that happens, but morals can also falter. So, getting to some of the stories I heard in the process of doing research in the Indian community. Most of the recent migrants Indian migrants to the Indian women migrants to Australia are professional, educated women. They don't fit the stereotype of women who cannot speak English, who have low education, who cannot be in the workforce. And Geeta was quite like that. In her late 80s, she'd already got an MBA. She was working in India when she got married. And she said, she was looking forward to a dream of a happy marriage. When she came to Australia, her husband said, he did not want her to go to work. And within 6 months, she became pregnant, so there was no discussion about it. And she had no money of her own. She had to ask him for money. she had so little money that she said, he gives me coins rather than notes, that for the first few years, she had never taken a train alone from her house to the shopping center or the city because it cost $8 something. So she said, but I was happy enough. It was his wish, whatever he wanted to buy, he'd buy. Whatever he wanted me to wear, I'd wear. But at the same time, he had taken her phone away. He didn't want her to communicate with her parents. He isolated her. He locked up the letter box so that she couldn't receive the letters. And one day she had to return a library book, and there was an overdue fine, and she had no money in hand. And she remembered hearing that there was an account in her name with $200 in it. So she walked to the bank and she said, can I take $100 out? But he had third party access to it. And so he knew that she had taken money out. And then one thing led to another. Physical abuse started, and it was the beginning of the end of her marriage. So what we get from Gita's story is unvarnished male control of money without any sense of the families, of his marital family's welfare. Chitra's story actually tells us that often in the Indian family violence and the experience of Indian violence, family violence, there is a joint family dimension that is not always present in other cultures. Chitra Bitlagita was also a professional. She had worked in India before marriage. Her marriage was arranged as often is, in a final relationship of her extended family. And she came to Australia with a spouse visa to join her husband's joint family here. And the brother-in-law was there, and things kind of degenerated right from the start. He said that, look, you're on a spouse visa and you better obey me, or he said he'll break her bones and send her back to India. The mother-in-law, who in the beginning, they had said, no, 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 we don't want a dowry, we don't want a dowry, we only want the girl, then started needling her that she comes from a poor family, she did not bring a dowry, whereas the eldest daughter-in-law had brought a big dowry. Then they tried to prevent her from working, and you need to again take a professional test in order to qualify for the profession she was in. And they tried to prevent her from appearing for the exam, saying you won't pass anyway. Well, with her mother's intercession from India, she did appear for the exam and she did pass the first stage. Well, after she passed that exam, she got such a severe beating that she ran out onto the street and went to the police station. Her jewelry remained in her brother-in-law's locker. It was supposed to be there for safety. She never got it back. And later, only after the divorce, she realized that she had signed for a loan for joint family property. So what you have is a mixture of joint family violence, dowry, and debt. And she kept thinking that maybe it was not really her husband's fault, that he was needled by everybody else. But it was the end of her marriage in a very short time. And this is the story of Asha. She is an IT professional. She came to Australia to study. And her family were middle class. They had taken out a loan. So she studied, she did well, she got a job. And in the beginning, she started sending $1,000 home every month in order to repay the loan. Her father had already repaid the loan, but he accepted the money. And then soon after the loan was repaid, he had a stroke. And then she was sending money home so that, for his treatment. And she married another Indian student. They fell in love. And they had some very frank and free and open discussions, she thought. They talked about whether they keep a joint account or not, and how much money they put into the joint account, how they can use the rest of the money. And she told the student who came from another part of India, that she sends money home and there was no problem. But as soon as she got married, the whole tenor of the conversation changed. And then he objected to her sending money home and basically saying, why are you sending money to your father? You're married to me. You should be giving all your money to me. You are now of my family. And it went on to, how come you eat rice? You should be eating chapati now that you're married to me. How come you worship your God? You should be worshiping my God. And he stopped contributing to the household expenditure or to the mortgage. Though she was the main earner, and she had bought a kind of a papadum that's special to her state in India, and it cost $2.50. And he said, how come you bought it in this suburb when you're not 10 kilometers away? It is available for $2. And she was the one who was basically supporting the household. Prema's story is one that perhaps remains with me for a longer time. Uh, she comes from a very traditional uh, business family in Punjab. And she said that family violence was kind of normal in our house. Nobody talked of it. You could hear the beatings. It was a joint family, but the grandparents also didn't say it was bad. The mother didn't talk of it, and the children were so scared. The father had a sword, and they were usually hiding under beds. And so she basically got herself up and into the point where she trained as a teacher, did tuitions, got her own money, and came to Australia as a skilled permanent resident, hoping to flee the kind of family violence she had seen in her natal home, and thinking that she is going to take control of her life and her future. Well, 5 years after she arrived, her family pressured her that she should get married. And they organized a marriage with a person from her extended family network. And this guy was already in Australia, but his visa was expiring. And she felt that she could not withstand the pressure. And at the point of marriage, she said, I was like a goat for sacrifice, a bakri for halal. But she agreed. The first year was all right because she was the one with the permanent residence card, the PR card. She knew he had married a PR card, but things were not bad. Since she was the main earner, she tried to set him up for a job in a business, but he gambled about 35,000 away. And then he got his PR. Uh, and he had had an accident before marriage, and he got a compensation of 200,000. And without her knowing it, he had sent all that money to India. She only found out when she went to India. And in a fight, he poured drain cleaner down her throat, which left her whole throat all seared and, her gut all wrenched. And she found that when he left the marriage, he also took her jewelry. So I asked her, I said, didn't you make a police report? Didn't the hospital ask you? She said, when the hospital did ask me, I said I was trying to commit suicide because she said everybody would have been against me if I had reported it. And then at the end of about a 2.5 hour interview and another 2 hours of visit, she asked me, have I cheated my 6-year-old daughter of a father? Now, at the same time, she's got a job and she's studying. And she is gaining courage by telling her story in the community to family violence audiences. So I guess with these stories, what you have is that there is a distinctiveness in the experience of financial abuse in the Indian community because the gender of money is bounded by joint family norms, because there is a feeling that money is owned by the family. There is an assumption that male control is normal and is going to be responsible. So a lot of the women, about 11 of the 17 women, actually started life with an account that was controlled by the husband. Now, this is very different, but this doesn't mean that financial abuse and family violence is only something that happens to minority communities and to migrant communities. And that's why it was very important for us to study the Anglo-Celtic side of it also, that it happens in every community, but it happens and is experienced in a different way. And that is very important because you don't just signal out something like dowry or forced marriage and say, yes, if we solve this problem, we're not going to have financial abuse, we're not going to have family violence. What you have to see is that it is a universal problem of coercive control that targets the gendered identities of a woman. And part of the gendered identities is the gender of money. And so it means that policy and practice has to change because with policy, you can't sort of say, well, we'll tackle this particular cultural trait because money is cultural in every culture. It is not that it is particularly cultural in one culture and not in the majority culture, because the majority community often does not realize that the way they do it is actually quite distinctive and very different from the way the rest of the world do it. So the Anglo-Celtic experience of money is not shared by people of the global south. For people of the global south, the family boundary of money, the intergenerational reciprocity of money is very important. And that is what is behind the remittances of some $450 billion every year to developing countries. Uh, so we have started working with NGOs to understand how the gender of money is different in different cultures and how it helps shape the experience of financial abuse. So that if an Indian woman comes to an NGO and there's an Anglo-Celtic woman, and she usually doesn't come saying, I'm suffering financial abuse. She usually says, I'm looking for a job, I need a house, I need some emergency funds. And when she starts telling the story and she says her mother-in-law has her jewelry, a kind of a red flag goes up. And you have to start recognizing these red flags in order to prevent family violence. And that has been a very important sort of step forward once you take this perspective. But what was also, it's a difficult project. It's difficult hearing the stories of abuse. It's difficult sitting down and absorbing it. But it was also a very empowering project because you saw how these women who were talking to you, and these are women who had survived family violence, who had past experience of family violence, uh, how they had taken steps, slowly, step by step, to survive it. And there were a lot of strategies there to help them. Women like Asha, who survived, now she helps other women, not necessarily in family violence as such, but in terms of financial resilience, in terms of meditation, in terms of getting to know yourself and to understand and to appreciate yourself. Some like Prema, who has a young child and a job, she is studying for 2 diplomas so that she can go back to teaching, which was her original love and her original profession, rather than customer service, and try and build a future for herself and her daughter. And at present, her daughter is the only one at the center of her life, but slowly she's getting to appreciate that she is worth something herself and can help other women. And that's why when the first time she got up in front of a community audience and said, I have suffered family violence, That for her was a very big thing because she had kept it hidden from nearly everybody except 2 or 3 people in Australia. Older women that I spoke to, older Anglo-Celtic women and older Indian women, there was a lot of silence around it. And when there was physical abuse happening, they thought the physical abuse was happening only behind closed bedroom doors, and the children didn't know. And one of the women who suffered this for more than 20 years and finally left only because her children said if she didn't leave, they would leave. Only then did she discover that her son said, "Oh, well, now I can sleep all night." And she discovered that her son had remained awake half the night, wondering if he needed to protect his mother from the beatings. So they have started to talk openly about it and talk of family violence because they know it's important to share some of these experiences and talk about money so that the children don't go through what they have gone through. But I think the highlight of this project was very much uh, that women are now seeing how they can feel empowered. I asked one of the women, the woman, the Anglo-Celtic woman who talked of taking her children to the town and they went to the bathroom before they came home to save money on the water bill. I asked her, I said, "So you have survived." She had started studying, and she was a teacher in the beginning. Then she became a teacher of a different language, and then she started studying to become a psychologist. And she had ended up and emerged as a psychologist. And I said, "You've survived." And she gave me a big hug and she said, "No, Supriya, I'm not survived. I'm empowered." So I let it be there. Thank you so much.
That was really very great presentation, very deep. I was just listening to it and thinking that many people take it to be as a normal behavior, but it actually is an abuse. And until we listen to all of these talks and discuss it, we don't know what it is. So thank you so much. And at this time, we are ready to take the questions. Please send your questions in the chat box, or in case you want to ask it, raise your hand and we will unmute you. So, yes, we have our first question. Um, it's from AK, and they're saying, Gita's story, how does one help the female that is being oppressed and abused by her husband and his family when the female is refusing contact with her family relatives due to fear or verbal emotional abuse?
Yeah, what happened with Geeta was that for a long time she thought, well, this is what happens, and I'm quite happy. I have 2 children, I have a husband. But when he started beating her and started beating the children, she ran to the neighbor's house and they told her that she must call the police because of the Family Violence Protection Act and because of greater awareness of family violence now in Australia in general. Uh, Instead of just having, 1 or 2 members of the police who act on family violence or just see it as a domestic. Now, family violence has become a very great part of police activity. So the police came after a couple of hours, and then she didn't want to have an intervention order. But when the beatings continued, and it was like assault, with he had taken her passports and assault, then she called the police again, and the police in the end arrested him and took him into the lockup. And when he came, he had to leave home. So it was very much at that point where she knew the neighbors from the child group, her children's play group. And then later on, she got help from an Indian NGO who was supporting her in the court process.
Okay. Hope. Yep. Any more questions? We're waiting for questions. There's a handout. Oops, sorry, Kulvinder Singh ji. Do you want me? Would you like me to unmute you? Okay, Kulvinder Singh, you can ask your question.
Hanji, Professor Singh, I wanted to ask you, in my visits to Australia, I have seen there's a lot of anti-immigrant attitude now. Do you think this has anything to do with there being so many Indians?
You mean so many more Indian cases of family violence?
I'm talking about in general.
Oh,
What's going on in
uh,
Australia? Is there an attitude shift in the Australians? Because as a Sikh, as a visible, observant Sikh, I was very comfortable when I visited. But I've been reading now about. I'm not asking about the subject of your talk. I'm sorry. I'm asking specifically about the attitude of Australians toward Indians in general now.
actually, it's a kind of a mixed bag. You definitely have the growth of the extreme right, where they fan an anti-immigrant claim, but on the same sort of breath, as it were, if the government wants to clamp down on immigration, it's the business community that is standing up and saying, no, without migration, we are not going to have growth, economic growth. And the support in surveys for multiculturalism remains very high. What we are having a little bit like, and it's unfortunate, like some other countries, is increasing sort of sentiment against Muslims. And this is also fanned by some of the politicians who keep talking about Muslims and terrorists in the same in the same sentence. So there is some kind of fanning of sentiment against Muslims, but that both parties have behaved very immorally and cruelly to asylum seekers. So it's a little bit like asylum seekers are illegal, they're queue jumpers, and Australia has not fulfilled its commitments in terms of, safeguarding their human rights. So it's a mixed bag. In terms of how migration affected these women, uh, it didn't affect these women very much. For instance, in Chitra's case, her husband was a permanent resident or a citizen. She came on a spouse visa. So when she fled and went to the police station, she went then to, the hospital. And later on, she went into a refuge for 6 months. So she was given all the support that a citizen would have been given. But if she had been on a tourist visa, for instance, like some of the wives who come, they first come on a tourist visa, then she would not have been eligible for some of these supports. So then you fall between the cracks. But otherwise, in the stories that I've heard of family violence, I don't think it is a question of people that they have sought help from. And actually, in the very first story that I heard, which set me on this journey, Ekta's story, she got more help from her Greek neighbors, her Anglo-Celtic employers than she got from her own community. Partly she didn't have networks in her community, uh, but the people she met around, they were the ones who were helping her. And the point when she broke into tears was saying that when she worked as a teller in a bank, she had about 2 or 3 jobs. When she worked in a teller in a bank and she had left home and she had a little daughter, and the daughter was in kindergarten, and she had to leave at a certain time, then her colleagues would do all the shopping and all for her daughter, and allow her to leave early so that she could pick up her daughter, and knowing that she didn't have a car. So she felt very supported. And I think I didn't get the racist element. But I want to say, and I guess why I made the point, uh, sometimes, say in the Gurdwara, they don't like to talk about family violence because they think, oh, it's going to spoil our reputation. You know, people will say, it's only the Punjabis who have it, it's only the Sikhs who have it, it's only the Hindus who have it. And they don't recognize that it is, and even people in our community don't recognize it's a universal phenomena. A lot of the Indian women ask me, you mean it happens elsewhere? So these are
Well,
some of the factors.
Professor Singh,
Yeah.
in my experiences in California now, where we have the very educated as well as the farm worker, less educated people, it's a matter of learning parenting. And, corporal punishment certainly has changed over the two generations now. So there are techniques out there that we're employing where we have a lot more people. We have more people in California than all of Canada, and certainly probably twice what you have in Australia. Are you finding that there are counselors? Are you finding that there are other services available in the Indian community where you are?
There are now NGOs in the Indian community that have come up particularly to address family violence. But actually, the main cultural institution still remains the religious institution. And there are people in our gurdwaras who are working with interfaith organizations who are of very great help. But I myself have gone to the Gurdwara Council. I have gone to Hindu temples and I've spoken about it. And I have sent them the government safety notice of where people can go to when they suffer family violence. I have asked people from other Gurdwaras whether those safety notices have been put up, and they've said no. And definitely in the Gurdwara that I go to, there is no such safety notice. It is a little bit like if you don't talk about it, it will go away. And it's not particular just to our cultural institution. It is, the total absence of religious institutions as part of the support network is absent.
Okay,
But
then let me take you one more place, and I hope I'm not monopolizing the time here, a moderator.
No, we have enough time. You
Okay,
can go on.
I have not expected Gurdwaras to do anything. I have found that it's let's say we're a group of parents. We would organize something like a Hemkund speech competition. We would organize something like a parade. We would organize an activity where we would participate in. So it may be that, Professor Singh, that there are women there, right? Because women talk to other women all the time, right? That would pass on this information where the courses are, where the counselors are, where the services are. And it may just be that there's sometimes a language barrier, right?
sure, sure.
So someone that has less English would prefer to hear it from someone in Hindi or in Punjabi, right?
And also the cultural thing,
So
a lot
so
of the women don't
you
want to
can't make
talk
the
about.
Gurdwara do something.
No, a lot of they won't do something. But what I'm saying is that, when a woman arrives for the first time and then she goes to the Gurdwara, that is her idea of the community. She's not aware often of others. And particularly as family violence involves a very isolating aspect. And it's not just for migrants, it's for everybody. Part of family violence is the impulse to isolate the woman. But as a migrant, where she doesn't have any other family or friendship networks, this becomes quite severe. But you are absolutely right. We can't just call on some of these traditional organizations. So what we are trying to do through a large multicultural NGO is to support women leaders in different cultures who can work in their community. And there are already a lot of wonderful women working in this area who are using their time and supporting. But what happens to these women is they're often working alone. And often they have 4 days of training, and then the training is not updated. And by linking them to an NGO into a program, we link these women not only to each other, but to also to other women across cultures who are trying to do the same thing. And this NGO then becomes responsible for making sure that the training is up to date. And we are hoping that this way, the NGO also gets a lot more women coming to it from different cultures and saying they have a problem, even if they say, okay, I have a problem with, I know I need a job. That's what they often come to a general NGO. And that's exactly what we're trying to do, to build up a women community leadership that's trained and connected.
You used the term NGO, non-governmental organization.
Non-government organization, yes.
Why don't
We
you try something at the local level?
Yes, this is at the local level, but a lot of these initiatives are supported at the state level. When the Royal Commission submitted its report, it had some 257 recommendations, and the state government has accepted all of them. And part of it was that, we have to help some of the traditional organizations and build women community
Do you
leaders.
have a women's shelter? Do you
Oh,
have
we
parents?
have women centers,
Yeah.
yes, and Chitra went to one of those.
Or I'm not referring to your
all them
case.
refugees.
I'm not referring to your case study. I'm referring in general. If
Yes,
I'm
we
going
have
into,
shelters, not enough of them, and not enough that are culturally appropriate. And also, part of it is that the women in our cultures who, and maybe across cultures, who are suffering family violence, they're really hoping for a way to make the marriage better. They don't want the marriage to break. They're hoping somebody will advise the husband to behave in a better, more educated, more caring way. And so they don't want to go to outside organizations. So getting to a shelter is sort of the extreme end of the spectrum. What we are hoping is through some of these women community leaders is that we nip it in the bud and prevent it from getting to that stage. If the woman can talk to another community leader and feel that she's not alone.
I'm hearing a lot of negative experiences from your scholarship, and I'm sure it does exist in the West Coast here in California. But I also have come across resources and certainly lawyers, right, in the community. It should not be so bleak that you have to go to an NGO to try to help some people that are
Well, I think,
financially so
yeah.
so chained up. And I don't see money or even a job having a gender.
I think in the US you have had Indian organizations helping women for a much longer time than we have had in Australia. I mean, I'm talking of 2016 when this great awareness happened. Before that, even the police weren't working at it. They'd say it's a domestic. But now it's become part of at least the state's agenda. They recognize it's one of the biggest law and order problems. So we have moved far in 2 or 3 years, but we don't have the same scale of Indian organizations who are helping. But some of these women now who have suffered family violence, they're at the front line of helping other women. Now that they've survived it, they know what it feels like, and they put themselves out there. It's also a healing process for them, but it's also giving back to the community. So we are seeing that there are a lot of people trying to help, but we're also seeing that some of these, you see, it's happening a lot to recent migrant women who are coming to get married, who come as brides. And marriages then fall apart in the first 2 years, partly because what you have is migration and marriage in a new country and family violence coming together.
Professor
So
Singh, right there, for what you've just shared, right? First couple of years, marriage and issues. What the solution is that I've seen other people do is they just go back.
Uh, it's actually one woman. She was a she had a dowry problem, and she graduate of a very well-known metropolitan university, and it was an arranged marriage. She's a public research professional. Arranged marriage, and you know how you have email contact, and the man came a week before marriage. 2 days before the marriage, the family said they wanted a dowry. Yeah, they wanted this gold, they wanted a car, they wanted so much money. And the girl's relatives, they advised the parents, don't do it, because once their mouths are open, they'll always be open. They asked the daughter said he looks very kind and he's very gentlemanly. And they thought, okay, we'll give the gold, but we won't give the rest of the stuff. Came back, and the physical abuse started. uh, she finally told her mother, and then she told her in-laws. The in-laws told her go back, and her father sent her a ticket, and she went back. What happened with her also happens with a lot of other women. The boy said, oh, no, no, forgive me. And she wanted a marriage to have a chance, and she came back. And then actually, when it broke and there was physical violence and the police were called, and she actually feared for her life, then family violence NGOs helped her, and people in the community also helped her. And then they had to persuade her not to go back because she had a good future. And when I met her, she said, I'm so glad I stayed, because she wanted to build up financial resilience. She wanted to build up a future for herself. And the laws in Australia now say that if you're on a spouse visa and you have suffered family violence and there is evidence of family violence, then you're given permanent resident. You don't have to wait for sponsorship from your husband. And so she has now chosen to stay, whereas before she was very willing to go.
Professor Singh, have you come across any fraud?
Any fraud
Yeah,
in
which means
terms of
somebody
this law?
comes somebody
This
comes
law,
to Australia, alleges the violence or the issues just in order to be able to stay in Australia.
uh, uh, a lot of people say this, but the police data show that it's minuscule, because you have to have a fairly a wide range of evidence to show that you have been abused.
I'm not
And
asking you to prove it. I'm asking you if you've come across it.
I
And
haven't come across, but I
who
have
do?
definitely come across people who have raised the question, and that's why I investigated it through the police reports. Uh, and they also, these are administrative rules, and they also said that the incidence of fraud is minuscule.
Okay.
All right. Um, I'm
This was
listening.
something to think about. I just had not seen this approach from another country, and I want to thank you, Professor Singh, for your scholarship. It just seems the local resources are not quite developed yet. That's probably going to be the solution.
That's right. We in early days yet, because all in the beginning, the Indian community would have organizations where older people would meet, and then you have the gurdwaras, which are, as I said, and the temples, which are the main organizations. They would be the cultural centers also. But now with some of the recent migrants who are coming, they've become politically and culturally more active. They're also half the Indian population in Australia, so our population has gone up dramatically in the last 10 years. Uh, and so slowly they're building up. And what we have is not enough. But also, I think sometimes the women are worried about talking to their own also, because they're hoping that this matter will be resolved. They'll still have a marriage, and there are, general relationship. Australia, for instance, does counseling, but then, the couple has to realize they have a problem to go for counseling, and so that's often an issue.
Okay. So I hope, Kuvinder Singh, you got all your answers.
Yes, I did, and some more topics to discuss with Jakara group out here.
Okay. We have, I think it looks like it should be the last one. There's one more question pending, actually two from AK. First, they say that the issue discussed is an issue in Canada as well. How can we as a society or a member of Indian community help females? Because many females do not seek help due to fear or potential backlash from the Indian community or people.
It's a huge question, because I kept asking. I said, did you talk to anybody? Did you go and discuss it? Did you mention it? Partly it is that the woman who is suffering the family violence, she's new to the country, doesn't have her own networks. So often the information is coming from the media, from television, because now there's a greater awareness. So family violence is talked about a lot in the media, but it's not talked about a lot in our personal circles. So I think what's happening now is that in small eddies, as it were, people are starting to say, look, it happened to me. And it's not the end of the world. This is what happened. This is, what I've learned from it. This is what I hope my children are learning from it, so that they don't experience it. We still have, despite all of this in our communities, I think our communities need to learn that it is a universal problem. 1 in 3 women suffer family violence across the world, and 1 in 4 women in Australia suffer intimate partner violence. It is not something that it needs to be hidden in the community. It needs to be addressed. I just want to share with you, we have a White Ribbon Day. I don't know whether across different countries you have the same thing, where you buy a white ribbon and you express your solidarity with the movement against family violence. And actually, it was announced in the Gurdwara last year that a lot of men wanted to pay money for it, but they didn't want to wear the ribbon. So, and at the same time, you do have men who are working, but working through interfaith to address this problem. So it's not all bleak, but it's also, I think we have to go uh, below the below the rhetoric of equality and all in our religions. And I got a lot of lectures from a lot of religious people about how, in Hinduism and Sikhism women are equal, and yet in our governance structures, then I asked how many women are on your executive committee, and most often the answer was none. So we also have to have a more gender equitable representation of the governance of our cultural institutions, where our people are migrants. And so it's something that's I mean, look, I'm talking about it. I've talked about it in Australia. I'm writing about it, and not just writing about it and not just talking to the community. We're talking across communities. So it's happening. What can I say about somebody else? I myself didn't know I had suffered it until it became a problem that everybody was talking about. So sometimes, we don't have the language for it.
Yeah, and to answer their own question, AK adds to it that I think the solution is to educate the community and improve services provided at Gurdwara, which is like community center for many newcomers, as it is a gathering place for many. Yeah, they say thank you, and it's a lot to think about.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Right.